Hello friends and welcome back to the channel. Today we're exploring a world of animals that is fighting against time. The world of vernal ponds in the German forests. These ponds only exist for 4 to 12 weeks at the beginning of each year when the spring rain starts, right after winter, and the animals that live in there, they have to hatch, grow and reproduce within 4 to 12 weeks only. Today we'll explore fairy shrimp, tadpole shrimp, caddisfly larvae, and many more animals in this video. So let's dive right in. The first species we'll explore today is the fairy shrimp. Fairy shrimp live all over the world, and in Germany we have a particular species of translucent fairy shrimp. They are living in these waters only at the beginning of each year. Fairy shrimp have 11 pairs of legs. Those legs have different functionalities. They are called phyllopodia and have three main functionalities. On the one hand side, they act as gills, helping the fairy shrimp to breathe. They also work as swimming paddles, helping them to move through the water column, and they act as food filters, basically acting as their mouths to filter microorganisms out of the water. They have a super high metabolic rate. So when a human has a heart rate or resting heart rate of around 60 beats per minute, they have around 250 beats per minute in their hearts, which is quite impressive, I think, for such small creatures. They are naturally camouflaged. That means they are translucent and they only change color or only show a color when they eat certain compounds, for instance, certain algae or other stuff that makes their intestines look orange or greenish at sometimes, and also other colors are possible. Fairy shrimp are usually 2 to 3 centimeters, that's around 1 inch long, and have a very interesting reproduction strategy. These German fairy shrimps are very special compared to other fairy shrimp all around the world because they hatch when it's still extremely cold. When it's right after the freezing point of water, so right after 0 degrees Celsius, they start to hatch. That is often the case when snow melts, for instance, and the eggs of the fairy shrimp that were laid the year before are getting in contact with wet water that is not ice anymore, then they start to hatch. And this gives them a huge advantage. Since fairy shrimp are translucent and don't have a lot of protection against predators, this is their best survival strategy, so to say, to survive in the German waters and in the German spring, so to say, or between the time of winter and spring, because they are just the earliest creatures to arrive. The fairy shrimp lay eggs. They are also called cysts, and they are almost indestructible. I mean, indestructible on quotation marks, but they are resistant against freezing temperatures, against desiccation, against freezing or extreme freezing temperatures, and even against the digestive tracts of birds. That means if you think about a bird like a mallard duck or a Egyptian goose that is quite common here in Germany at this point in time, when they enter such a pond or a local forest river or creek rather, and they get in contact with the shrimp eggs, or they on accident eat those eggs, then the eggs, they get through their digestive system, and once the bird enters the next local creek, local pond, or local puddle, and the shrimp eggs accidentally enter this one, they can just repopulate that whole puddle. That means that rather randomly, new ponds can be populated with fairy shrimp all at once. These eggs have another feature that is quite neat in nature. They can survive for more than 10 years in a dried pond or in a dried riverbed. And once water touches them, they are reignited, so to say, and can start the whole process again. They have an interesting ecological role. So fairy shrimp are filter feeders. As I mentioned, they have these 11 pairs of legs, which help them to filter the water. And this means that they constantly remove bacteria, protozoa, algae, microorganisms that are way smaller than them, and organic matter out of the water, making the water clear and filtering it for other species. Also, by doing that, they convert microscopic algae, which are protein poor, let's say, into very protein rich food source for other animals, for higher trophic layers, so to say. Because the fairy shrimp themselves, as tons of other crustaceans have very high protein contents. So basically, you could say they are the first major protein source after winter for other animals and higher trophic layers in those vernal ponds and pools. They have an interesting connection to birds. If a bird drinks from a puddle and ingests some of the fairy shrimp eggs, they can transport those eggs to other puddles and other pools. They are There are some rather large predators. I mean, large in quotation marks because the fairy shrimp are very tiny that can eat them. One of them is, for instance, the tadpole shrimp. The tadpole shrimp is, so to say, the king of these little pools and ponds here in the forest. Tadpole shrimp are, on the one hand side, competing with fairy shrimp because they are omnivorous. That means they eat practically everything that fits into their mouths, but they will also prey on smaller fairy shrimp. But more about the tadpole shrimp in a minute. Fairy shrimp constantly swim in open water. Therefore, they are not really competing with, let's say, mayfly nymphs, for instance, and caddisfly larvae, which we will also cover in a minute. Those animals, on the one hand side, eat the same stuff. They eat biofilm, they eat protozoa, they eat smaller algae and all that kind of thing. So mostly herbivorous nutrition, I would say. But they inhabit another niche. So the caddisfly larvae and the mayfly nymph, they more live on the ground of the little puddles and creeks, while the fairy shrimp lives in the open water column. And a fairy shrimp's whole lifespan from hatching to death is roughly 40 to 90 days. So not even a quarter of a year, which is extremely short. And this is only due to that fact that they have adapted perfectly to these spring pools that at the beginning of the summer, they start to emerge from melting water in Germany. And then at one point they dry out. And within that time, the whole life cycle of a fairy shrimp has to be completed. For me, this almost sounds like a fairy tale, basically. Hence the name fairy shrimp. The next that is on our list is the caddisfly larvae. Caddisfly larvae are insects, not crustaceans. So compared to fairy shrimp, they are completely unrelated, I would say. They reach 1 to 4 centimeters in length, which is like 1 to 2 inches. They live a few months in this larval stage underwater, and then for 1 to 4 weeks they live out of the water or on the air, so to say, in order to mate. And you could basically see these caddisfly larvae as underwater moths or underwater butterflies. They are the closest living animals that are related to moths and butterflies, but they have completely adapted to a life underwater, which I think is extremely interesting if you think about it. And somehow they also look similar to moths and butterflies, at least their mouth parts and the front part of their body. Of course, if you look at the lower part of their body or at their abdomen, it looks quite unusual for an insect. It looks like they have a house that they carry with themselves. And this is actually what they do. They build their own cases, and the way they do this is they produce a bio-adhesive silk that when it gets into contact with water, and these animals are always constantly underwater, it directly hardens, and it is used to attach other structures, for instance, sand, stone, but also twigs and leaves to their abdomen, basically. And this way, they build their own protective shell that protects them against predators and also helps them camouflage themselves. They have different kind of materials that they use for this. And there's also a fun fact that I found out, and maybe I can also insert some pictures here. Some artists gave them gold and jewels to build their cases with, and they actually did that. So the little caddisfly larvae built little golden cases for themselves, which looks very interesting. I don't know if it's too animal friendly, to be honest, but it's definitely interesting that they do that. And the caddisfly larvae that we have in these local puddles and creeks here, they usually use leaves. So just like a fallen leaf from a tree. It's actually quite nice taste smelling one. This will fall into the creek, and the caddisflies, they use it to build their cases with that once it's submerged underwater. And they are recyclers. They not only use leaves to build their cases, they also decompose fallen leaves and eat them, basically. They turn nutrients into protein again and can be preyed upon by larger animals and act as a protein layer as well. They have a low tolerance for water pollution, and in agricultural areas, they often have a hard time. This is the same for fairy shrimp, actually surviving because of pesticides, herbicides, and high fertilizers or artificial fertilizers, because they need high water quality and very high water purity. And the next animal that we have on our list is the first one that is actually a little more dangerous to the other ones. It's the tadpole shrimp. And tadpole shrimp have their name because of their shape. They basically look like tadpoles. I mean, if you look at the tadpole shrimp and the tadpole next to each other, they have this typical thick body and then the small tail that is just this typical tadpole shape. That's why they are called tadpole shrimp. And the specific species that we have in German puddles, creeks, lakes, rivers is called Lepidurus apis in Latin. It gets 4 to 6 centimeters, so 2 to 3 inches tall, or long rather, and it has a lifespan of 1 to 3 months. So very comparable to our fairy shrimp that we've discussed at the beginning of our video, but a little bit of a different ecological niche for those tadpole shrimp. So they have the same problem like our fairy shrimp. They have to finish their whole cycle of life within those 1 to 3 months when the German creeks and ponds are created by the melting water, and when they dry up again. They have to fit their whole lifespan into that. And if they don't manage to reproduce by the end of that time period, they just die and cannot create any offspring for the next year, for the next season. They hatch usually shortly after the fairy shrimp, and I don't know why that actually is the case, but a simple explanation for that would be that the fairy shrimp, they hatch first, and since tadpole shrimp often prey upon fairy shrimp, the small delay helps them to have at least some kind of prey that they can prey upon. However, the tadpole shrimp is an omnivore. They will eat basically everything. Next to fairy shrimp, also biofilm. They usually also sift through the sediment to find food there, and they are basically omnivorous. But of course, they are welcoming any kind of protein-rich snack, such as the fairy shrimp. And they usually hatch not at 0 degrees Celsius like the fairy shrimp, but more between 4 and 10 degrees Celsius, so a little later during the year. With regards to reproduction, they also have an interesting strategy. You must keep in mind that they have been around for a very long time. For a very, very long time. So tadpole shrimp have been living in our planet, in our rivers, ponds, puddles for roughly 200 million years. That's actually older than the T-Rex. They have been around for 200 million years, and there's a reason for that. They have very interesting reproductive strategies, similar to those of the fairy shrimp, but in many ways even more extreme. And what I mean by that is that tadpole shrimp, at least the Lepidurus apis that we have here in Germany, don't know about the other ones, they are hermaphrodites. That means they have both genders in one animal. That means that two random animals of any population can meet and can mate. And it's always the case that they have both sexes, and they can also fertilize themselves. And that helps them because if you assume that maybe one egg that is attached to the feathers of a bird, or that was eaten by a bird, or that was just randomly put into a puddle by chance, if it ends there, it can end up repopulating that whole puddle, that whole pond, with just one animal. And that helped them getting from 200 million years ago to today, basically, and surviving until then. Their eggs can, compared to the fairy shrimp, survive for a very long time as well. But while the fairy shrimp's eggs can survive for around 20 years, the tadpole shrimp eggs can survive for around 20 plus years. And they can also resist freezing and resist droughts as well. And tadpole shrimp are found all over the world. Lepidurus apis is one species that is spread over Eurasia and North Africa. And they are actually listed on the red list and are not critically endangered, but endangered in Germany. That's also the reason why I don't intend to show where we actually found them, and why I filmed this video today at another place in front of a local local forest creek and not in front of the original place where we found them, because we want to protect the place or the location where we found them, so no one goes there and actually gets them for the aquarium or anything, because they are in fact endangered. Diet, they are omnivores or opportunistic feeders rather. So they will usually sift through the mud and eat whatever they find there, plants and detritus, but also they will eat smaller fairy shrimp, and even if scarce, then they will eat other tadpole shrimp. Now that we've covered the tadpole shrimp, the fairy shrimp, and the caddisfly larvae, there's one more insect that I would like to cover, which is the mayfly nymph. The mayfly nymph has super interesting gills, in my opinion. They are moving and leaf-like gills, and they are used for oxygen extraction. They don't have this other functionality like in the fairy shrimp's case, where they are also used for moving. For moving, they just use legs. They molt up to 50 times before they exit the water, which is very interesting. I think there's almost no other insect that molts that often in its life, that lives underwater or probably even not underwater. So it's probably one of the insects that has the most molts in its life. Mayfly nymphs graze on biofilm and decaying plant matter and are completely herbivorous. So despite them looking quite horrifying and sinister, I think they look very similar to dragonfly nymphs. Actually, they are completely herbivorous and they wouldn't eat. I think they cannot even digest other animals such as the fairy shrimp. They live 1 to 2 years in these ponds underwater, also sometimes in local creeks, until they hatch, and then they only live for very, very few days out of water and only to find a mate and to reproduce. And they're very interesting. They're adult form, and you can actually see some of them flying around here in the video. I think there was one. The very interesting thing is that their adult form doesn't even have a mouth to eat. So they only get out of the water in order to mate, and then they die after a few days when they have reproduced and put eggs into the water again. Another interesting and probably also the last animal that we will cover today is the water bug or the back swimmer. The water bug is a animal that appears after the fairy shrimp and the tadpole shrimp are already there, so it requires even a little warmer temperatures, and it's the apex predator in this little ecosystem, at least the highest trophic layer that we will cover in today's video. The water bug lives up to 1 year and is a true predator, basically. It's not like the tadpole shrimp where it sometimes eats plants, sometimes eats animals, and sometimes even its own brothers and sisters. It's a true predator. It injects toxic saliva into its prey, so it dissolves from the inside out, and then it can suck out whatever is in the prey, which is quite painful for the animals and kills them. And the sting of a water beetle or a water bug rather is also very painful for humans. They prey upon young tadpole shrimp and also upon fairy shrimp. They are found in nearly in all still freshwaters around the world. And now, when the summer nears at the end of spring in Germany, all of these small puddles and rivers will dry up. And unfortunately, all of our main protagonists of today's video will die. And the not all of them, the mayfly nymph and the caddisfly larvae, they will metamorphosize into their adult form and try to reproduce, but the tadpole shrimp and fairy shrimp actually die. Before they die, they have to lay their eggs. The eggs will dry up, and then they need actually a cold shock at the end of the year or at the beginning of the next year when the winter comes. And after that, they are reactivated once the ice melts and the ponds are filled with water again. And then they will fill the pools and ponds with little shrimplets again. A single scoop of that forest soil can actually have hundreds or even thousands of eggs of these little shrimp in it. And I think that is super, super fascinating if you think about the possibilities that you have with such a little scoop. This is a great moment to say thank you to all of our channel members. I will put a list of our channel members here. This is the biggest and best way to support me and my work here. I try to produce one long form video every week. It takes me a lot of time, a lot of effort, and also a lot of costs. And your monthly contribution helps a lot. It starts from €1 per month, and you can just scan this code and join the Guppy or the Tetra Gang today. It helps me a lot. If you enjoyed this video, I'm sure you would enjoy watching this video about the effect of invasive fish on German rivers and lakes, or this video. Thanks for watching.